It's Puppy with Puppy's Toy Box. I'm a whip maker here in Seattle, Washington, and I'm getting a lot of questions about how to tell if a online whip is going to be a cheap, poorly made whip versus a higher quality whip, even if it's, sometimes you'll have a cheap one that's going to be more expensive or less expensive. So it's, price alone is not that necessarily that great of a tell. But one really easy tell that I find is actually pretty common is to look at the edges of each lace. And I know that kind of seems like a bit of a nitpicky thing, but the quality of the whip is determined by how tight the whip is. And how tight it is all contingent on the amount of space that's on the inside of the whip. So if we look at we've got about 5 different types of bevels here. The first one here is unbeveled, which is going to be really, really easy to spot. A lot of cheaper whips will have that, and they just don't care. This next one here is a double-sided top bevel. It gives it that kind of dome shape. This is going to be very, very common for doing like 4-plait braiding or handle work, or sometimes even I do a lot in fancy plait braiding, and that's going to make it a lot tighter, but it's not going to be necessarily practical for when you get into like a herringbone, which actually, if we go down here to this last one here, that kind of knocked over square shape, and I'll show you why this one is actually superior for doing the herringbone braid, which is what people usually use for most of the body of a whip. So that's going to be one of your best bevels for doing the body of the whip. This is an inversion of this, and the reason why somebody would do this is so that they can kind of hide the fact that it's beveled, so it's going to give it a little bit of a cleaner look, but that's going to sometimes allow the corners to kind of stick up depending on the type of leather that they're using. And then this last one here is called a convenient bevel, because it will always kind of work. The thing about it is it takes a lot more time, and it actually significantly weakens the leather. So let's go ahead and look at the next section here is why this is important. So if you look at this unbeveled drawing here, which I'm not an artist, so sorry, but you got this like square shape, and so when you come over here, you got this big amount of space in here, and that space is going to eventually loosen up the whip. If it's not already loosened, it's going to be really, really hard for you to get that whip tight in the very first place. So it's not going to be able to transfer energy well. And I'm going to say 9 times out of 10, when you're looking at a crappy, cheap whip, you're going to see that it's unbeveled. And that's just going to be the first easy tell. If we look at this one is what I was talking about for like the 4-plait braiding, or when you have a lot of ups and downs where you have a lot of laces crossing over each other. So that's going to be your double top-sided bevel there. And you see that closes up most of that space there. And so having that ramp basically for the lace to go over is going to allow you to get a much tighter braid. And here, this is kind of more of a depiction of what it would look like with Latigo versus kangaroo leather. So you can actually make a pretty decent whip out of Latigo. In fact, a lot of American whips back in the real ranching times, when there was a lot of cattle driving and they were using whips a lot, would use Latigo. Same thing with Australian red hide whips. Is actually basically almost the same thing as Latigo. And so this is like what you'd have with kangaroo leather. So I'm still getting that bevel in there, but you see even the space that was here is completely closed up when you're using a thinner leather. So a lot of people like to use kangaroo because it's so thin and yet so strong at that thickness that you can get a really, really tight braid and a really rigid whip, which is actually one of the things that you're kind of looking for if you pull a whip out of a box and it flops. That's a horrible whip. Send it back. You don't want that. You want something that's actually going to be relatively rigid. So if I pull out this guy, this is Latigo. But you see, I'm holding it up and it's staying completely straight. So if I were dealing with one that had a rope core, for example, and I'm going to do a video on cores here in a minute, but you see that doesn't hold at all, right? So it doesn't have the ability to transfer energy from your hand to whatever impact element you're using, or if you're doing sports cracking, to the popper. So you really want to have a whip that's, when you first buy it, it's going to have that rigidity. And you don't necessarily want to maintain that rigidity, and we'll cover that in a later video as well. But you want it to break in and then maintain a lot of that ability to transfer energy. So down here, when we look at how those laces are going to sit next to each other, that's another important thing. This is the unbeveled. You see all that space in between laces is going to be a problem. And this is one of the reasons why you don't necessarily want to braid on a core if you're using that double top-sided bevel, is that also creates a lot of space. So a lot of times, I'll do it when, I'll use it for when I'm doing fancy plaiting, because there's going to be a lot of up and downs. Laces are going to be going over the edges of those, and it's going to make for a better whip if I do. But if for the body of the whip, I want to use this tilted square, because you see it actually closes up all that space, and it's going to make for a very, very tight braid. So that's going to be your first easy tell. So, if I show you this guy, this is one of my galleys here, you can actually see that cut there. Even on a kangaroo whip, you will actually be able to see that. And here, I'll actually pull one out for you. Well, I've got two here. So this is the first whip I ever made. And you can actually, when you really, really look at that guy, you can see that there is no bevel on this whip. This was 11 years ago when I made this whip. And I still like this whip, but it's definitely, ropier than some of my newer stuff. So this one will be a little bit harder to tell, but if we look really, really close in here, this is about a 3 or 4 year old whip here. But you can actually see, maybe not on this camera, because it won't focus, but there's a little bit of a darker edge right here. That's where I've actually beveled this leather. And this whip, if you actually kind of look at it, it's, especially when you're really, really close here to the handle, like that's actually trying to maintain its shape. Now this is several years old. I've done a lot of cracking with it, but if you look at it compared to this one's actually a lot looser than this guy is. So, it makes a big difference, even if you're using the best possible material that's available on the market. Having an unbeveled edge is actually going to make a world of difference. You don't have to worry about it on nylon, because obviously you can't do anything about it with nylon. But when it comes to leather, absolutely always bevel your edges. And so if you're looking for a marker of quality in a whip, the first thing I look for is that edge bevel. All right, talk to you later.